say this is the beginning of fall, 2025, September presentation at the Half Moon Bay Library on a beautiful fall night. And we're very happy to be able to present to you tonight Richard King, who's going to be giving a presentation, of course, on the history of the whales and whaling on the Central Coast. And Richard is local, lives in Santa Cruz. He's the associate or is it a visiting professor in Massachusetts of the Sea Education Association. And he's written 5 books. They're all on the back table. And if you'd like to meet with Richard after the presentation, the books are all for sale. That's part of the opportunity here tonight. So I'm going to turn it over to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Patty, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Half Moon Bay Historical Society, for putting this on. And thanks all for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it. You could be, strolling, watching the sunset, looking for spouts on the horizon. So I appreciate you coming out tonight. Want to recognize that this won't really be a lecture. We're going to I'm going to present a few things, but there's a lot of expertise in the room. I'm sure there are, in any collection like this, there's like, well, I'm actually a whale acoustic specialist, and I know we have some famous marine mammal artists in the audience, and so there's a lot of expertise in the room, and so don't feel like you need to be quiet till the end, or if you want to save it till the end, feel free. But feel free to chime in any time if you want to share something, if you have a different perspective, if you want to add. Again, I'm not going to claim authority and expertise over all knowledge over whales and whaling in the Central Coast. I want to start with just this image. Has anybody seen this image before? I hadn't either till about 18 hours ago. And I was just looking for historical images, and isn't it amazing, right? Isn't it the most fascinating photograph? So this is the California coast. Looks like a gray whale there. They've got a cable up aloft on the cliff, another one around the tail, and all these people are coming out clearly to just observe this whale. We don't know if it was hunted or beached. The basic gist of what I want to present and what I hope we'll talk about when we get to the end is just how different are we than all those people looking at the photographer right now. And then once that photograph is snapped and they're going back and they're looking at that whale. And they're thinking things about that whale, right? They have a response to it. They're considering something. They have questions. They have knowledge. How different are we from them a century past? And why? Are some responses to the whale just intrinsic, innate, to just we as humans? Or is it all culturally learned in terms of how we respond and think about whales? Is there something specific to the Central California coast? Is there something specific to the Gulf of Mexico? Is there something specific to Yokohama, Japan? Where do these sort of concepts come from in terms of our relationship with whales? How many of you have been on a whale watch? So pretty good. I think we're about 85, 90%. I started to work on a whale watch out of Santa Cruz, and I'll tell you at the end, you can get a special discount, $10 if you'd like to go on our whale watch. Just mention this talk. But I've been on many whale watches, as many of you have before, and it always strikes me and just amazes me our response, right? You see that whale, and it's like, oh, and we're so excited, or at least many of us, or most of us, are so excited, and we respond to that animal in the water, just that big black hulk back, just coming through the surface, and it fills us, right? Fills kids, fills people of all ages, of all backgrounds, with a lot of joy. And where does that come from? Why do we respond that way? Were they responding the same way? Were whalemen in the 19th century responding the same way? or Ohlone responding the same way 5,000, 6,000 years ago? Where does that response come from? So I want to explore some of these ideas, talk about some of the history of the space, and then hopefully we can have some time to discuss it or discuss it along the way. One thing I think is really important is that when we talk about whales, particularly when we're talking about historic whaling, that we talk about species. Like, we need to recognize that it's not just whales, right? Like, they're all really different, they occupy different, that they occupy different ecological niches, they occupy different spaces, they have different migration patterns, and so when we think about whales, it's really important to sort of think about their different diets and the different ranges. And so, on a whale watch or something like that, oh, was it too soft, louder? Perfect. Perfect, okay, great, thank you. If someone says, like, how are the whales doing? Well, it's gotta be like, this is gonna get old. When we talk about how the whales are doing, we need to, like, which whales are you talking about? Which species? So for us on the California coast, the whales we see the most are the humpback whales and the gray whales. There's an arrow there to kind of see where they are in the taxonomic diagram. And most of our large whales, of course, are baleen whales. Our only really large toothed whale, which we do have in Monterey Bay, is the sperm whale. And then we've got our larger dolphins, our smaller whales, killer whales, Risso's dolphins, which are all toothed whales. But important to sort of think about those differences. And when it comes to historical hunting of whales for colonial nations and workers that came to this region, the type of whale mattered a lot. Because if it wasn't slow, they couldn't catch it, okay? And so there are only a couple species of whales that early whalers could catch, up until the late 1800s, early 1900s, where all whales were accessible to hunters. So, pretty familiar to this audience. We've got our gray whales, which are southbound in the Baltic Half, kind of that lumpy, dorsal edge towards the back, gray, kind of a lower bushy spout, and you can see that knuckled skin, and they are hunting more towards the bottom, more bottom. Humpback whales, which we sounds like somebody saw some today. I went out on a whale watch about a week ago, and they were just like, we saw about 20 in a matter of about 3 hours. They were in all directions. And so humpback whales can be around here year-round, but more common April to October. That really diagnostic with the really big pectoral fins, but also that sort of smooth black back and falcate dorsal fin at that upper edge. The other whales and dolphins that we'll see in our area, sperm whales. The thing about sperm whales, as most of you know, they're the only large toothed whales I mentioned, but they're diving down really deep. So the Monterey Canyon is great for sperm whales. They can dive really deep, get those big squids, those really big fish down in that region. But when they come up, they are tired. They spend an hour, sometimes over an hour, they come back. Whale watchers in like Itro, New Zealand refer to them as sort of floating logs. They come up, they're tired, and they're just sort of floating there. They're not doing like, rarely will you see a sperm whale, unless you're in a really coastal, more shallow region, doing these kind of big breaches and activities. They're mostly coming up, they're catching their breath, they're slow on the water, and their spout is actually pretty low and tilted forward, so even harder to see from afar. But our whale watch boats in, and our fishermen, of course, will see them out on Monterey Bay. They're out there, but they're not as coastal and local as we're going to see with humpbacks and gray whales. The thing about sperm whales, though, is they are slow. And so whalemen could catch up to a sperm whale first by rowing or by sailing and be able to catch it. Blue whale, many of you know, also here in Monterey Bay, largest mammal ever on Earth. They are a rorqual and they are fast. They're often solitary and they're quick moving. No whalemen in the 19th century, unless they were extraordinarily lucky, was catching a blue whale or a sei whale or a minke whale. They were just too fast. They're moving too quickly. They were spending a lot of time in really cold waters that they didn't have access to. So they just weren't available to early hunters until we get into an industrial era in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Pilot whales and rhesus dolphins. Whalemen in the 19th century and 18th century sometimes would hunt pilot whales and rhesus dolphins if they were close to the ship. They would get oil out of them, but it was almost like practice. They were like practicing on those whales, and they would eat the meat from those animals if they caught them. But not a massive, market, and we'll get into some of those things for our smaller toothed whales in our area. I just put the elfin seals up here, docents here, and many of you know Año Nuevo and the elfin seal story along our coast. But it is important to remember that it's not always really isolated. Like whalemen would go out and they would catch some elfin seals, and they would catch some fur seals, and they'd catch some humpbacks, and they would catch a right whale. It wasn't always really isolated. They might be targeting a particular animal, but they would hunt marine mammals in general at the same time. And so, particularly in the 19th century along the California coast, gray whales, northern elephant seals, large sea lions used for some similar market products. And I should apologize also, it's going to be a very here's how you kill a whale kind of talk, and I apologize for that. And that can be gruesome and insensitive. And so I apologize for that, and maybe in our discussion we can kind of talk a little bit about sort of whale personhood and autonomy. We have all recognized now and remember that we've had indigenous people here for over 5,000, 10,000 years in this area. They're still here. In this space here, after likely over 10,000 years of native residence and complex civilizations on this coast, at the time of European contact here in this region, with the Chiguan tribe of the Rebetish Ohlone. We're super lucky to have Catagones here, representing the Muchiate Indigenous Land Trust. And so I feel super uncomfortable trying to tell stories that are not my stories to tell. And so I'm so glad you're here and grateful that you're here. And I hope we'll hear from you maybe towards the end, or to talk about the land trust and your website. There are two really good websites of local native peoples. They've got really good lesson plans that are up there and good explanations of their history. I bring this up here to recognize just our time scale, right? And how many thousands of years we're talking about with people living along this coast, engaging with whales, engaging with marine mammals. But I think it's important to recognize in terms of when we're thinking about marine mammal populations and impacting marine populations, the indigenous people for thousands of years would have had little impact on sort of large scale, rendering any marine mammals extinct in our region, particularly whales. So the Ohlone along the coast and all the different communities and different language speakers in this area were going out, they were fishing, they were going out on rafts like this that Linda Yamane of the Rumson Ohlone down in Monterey has rebuilt. And so that these rafts have been built in San Francisco Bay, and this tradition is coming back as well. But that's a more coastal vessel in estuaries out along the coast and fishing. But in terms, and they certainly would have harvested beached whales along with the grizzly bears that were coming down along the coast. But in terms of large scale impact on marine mammal populations, I think it's fair to say that that's not really happening until American, British, and Russian colonists start to come. Kata, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to say that this area, the entire San Francisco Peninsula, is Ramaytush ancestral homeland, and Chiguan is actually a tribal ban for this area of this particular part of the coast, which would have included several village sites.
Thank you. So, some of you are familiar with Wilhelm Steller, the Bering expedition that goes across the North Pacific in the mid-1700s. They sort of just like barely touch Alaska, and then they turn around, they come back, they wreck out on what is now known Bering Island, and as they're kind of cruising through the Aleutians, they see these populations of Steller sea cows and of sea otters. Sea otters in the early 1700s, well known as a high-end trading product, both in Japan and in China. And so they start to mount expeditions to go back to the Aleutians, eventually to Alaska, to be hunting, eventually rendering extinct the Steller sea lion, the Steller sea cow, and moving along towards sea otters. And so the Russians, communities, hunters, moving along the Aleutians, often taking Aleutian laborers to help them hunt, and even settling, as many of you know, in Fort Ross near Bodega Bay. And they had a settlement there up until the 1840s. And they had expeditions going all the way down to California, to Southern California. But whales were not so much their interest. It was sea otters, it was the fur, and some of the skins, but they weren't so much boiling marine mammal oil for life. We'll talk about Charles Scammon as we go. When the Spanish arrived and set up the missions and moved into this region, often quite violently, they also were not really interested in marine mammals. The early expeditions certainly wrote about them. This is one of the more famous ones. This is actually a French expedition in Monterey Bay in 1786. It is impossible to describe either the number of whales with which we were surrounded or their familiarity. They glowed every half minute with half a pistol shot from our frigates and occasioned a most annoying stench. So the whales were so close that they were able to smell the blow right nearby. By that laugh, I recognize that many of you have probably smelled that same thing. But the Spanish that moved in were more interested in harvesting souls and rather than whales. And they were moving into this region. It was more agricultural. And then as the Mexican nation moved in, they also were more interested in, that was ranching, cattle, and they were primarily interested in selling cattle and the products from particularly the hides, and sending those out. Again, obviously this is the early 1800s. There's no sort of trading network out into a larger community other than by ship. That said, and when we kind of talk about technologies and how they impact marine mammal populations, by the late 1800s, northern elephant seals were considered commercially extinct, locally extinct along the California coast, as were gray whales, and as were, of course, sea otters. Okay, so let's kind of talk about, because what we're sort of getting to is like, okay, how is it that we have all these like shore whaling stations here in California? Like, how did that come to be? And then how in 1910 would we have a bunch of people standing on the coast looking at a whale that was stranded or hunted, and how would they have considered it as relevant to their lives along this coastline? I heard someone talking about it in the back, so it sounds like there's some understanding. Whale oil, particularly in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, they were taking the blubber from the whale, they were boiling it out, and making a fluid that would be used for light, sort of like a pre-kerosene product. Sperm whales had a particularly high-end waxy substance in their head, which we think is related to echolocation, and that early New Englanders found that they could make that into especially high-end candles that burned very cleanly with less odor. And so it was about light primarily for the early whalers. And the early New Englanders learned how to whale from Spanish and Portuguese that came over and showed them how to do so. And there was a lot of whaling out of Norway, out of Great Britain, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. English colonists moved into New England, and they started to hunt as well. And in the early 1700s, they found the sperm whale a little farther out, a little deeper, but primarily they were hunting what is the North Atlantic right whale. The North Atlantic right whale is sort of, and this is also crass, and I apologize, but it's sort of like the dodo of the marine mammal world. It was very large, very slow, very coastal, familiar, and so it was very easy to catch. And so the North Atlantic right whales were rendered almost locally extinct in the early 1700s. So there was no high-end technology that was rendering North Atlantic right whales commercially and locally extinct. And today, as many of you know, the North Atlantic right whale is critically endangered down to 300 individuals that are constantly being tracked. But that happened, that damage happened way early on in sort of our more recent local history, our more recent global history. So what happened is the whalers would have to go farther and farther away from port to get their load of oil. They had rendered commercially extinct the right whale. They started to go to sperm whales, and then the sperm whales were getting harder and harder to find, and so they were moving farther and farther away. And so they would mount expeditions that lasted longer and longer. And so that's why they start to move into the Pacific, and they basically had these vessels like this one, which were basically factory ships. If you're designing a wood ship, that first person was like, hey, I'm going to put a brick oven on the ship and we'll light a fire. Doesn't that sound like a great idea? But they did, because they wanted to be able to catch a whale, bring it next to the ship, peel off the blubber, and boil it out on deck so that they could put the oil into barrels and then eventually load the ship full with barrels and sail it back home to sell. So these voyages got longer and longer, moving into the Pacific in the late 1700s. Some of these voyages then were going for 3 to 5 years on average in the mid-1800s. The mid-1800s, the 1840s and 1850s, that's a sort of high point of whaling under sail in terms of the number of people that went out there and the number of whales that they were killing and hunting. They were primarily hunting right whales and sperm whales. They were moving into the southern right whales, and then eventually they would move up into the North Pacific right whales, and then up to bowheads up into the Arctic and Aleutian far North Pacific. For me, what I find particularly compelling about this era is thinking about, you're talking in the 1840s and 1850s, you've got about 10,000 young people, 18, 20, some of our captains were only 22, 23 years old, 10,000 people every year on over 600 vessels, just like this one, 100 feet long or so, 30 or 40 people on the ship, and they're going out of sight of land, not dropping an anchor, often for 4 or 5 months at a time. They're just zigzagging along the equator looking for whales. There's no fan noise, there's no electricity, there's no outside distractions, and they're sending someone up aloft there for 2-hour shifts every daylight hour. And I really don't think in the history of humanity, either before or coming up, that will have this many people out at sea watching the surface of the ocean carefully. So you're 8,000 or 10,000 people every year floating 3, 4 months at a time. Every hour, daylight hour, someone's up on deck, people are up aloft. They're looking for spouts. They're looking for hunks of squid. They're looking for big patches of krill. They're interested in the surface of the ocean, not always necessarily for any sort of natural history sense, but so that they can find whales and get home. It's a really compelling moment in human history. I'm not suggesting that whalers knew more about the ocean than, say, our early Polynesian navigators, But in terms of the number of people that were out there just slowly transecting the open ocean, it's super fascinating to think about. And we have all of these logbooks and journals from these whalemen. Some of them are quite businesslike, they're just describing where they are, but we have some journals that are really detailed and give an extraordinary snapshot of what the open ocean looked like in the mid-19th century. So the whale oil was the big product, right? For light, there was, as we started to move into the Industrial Revolution, whale oil was also used as a lubricant for small machinery, sewing machines, then it started to be moved into small industrial machines, and it starts to move into that, but also, which the sperm whale doesn't have, right whales, baleen, right whales, bowheads, the other baleen whales, the ones that aren't sort of chomping up fish and squid, the ones that are sitting out fish and plankton, had that baleen, right, these plates in their mouth, and that was the sort of plastic of the day. So that was another really valuable product. They'd be used for hoop skirts, horse whips, any kind of farm tool that you might think of that might be used for plastic today, sometimes really quite small, where baleen was used as a product. And so this is San Francisco docks, produced probably bowhead, baleen strips, all brought to market. So that was also really valuable. Again, they would catch a humpback every once in a while if they could, but primarily going for sperm and right whales. Sperm whales more towards the equator, at least particularly the matriarchal groups, the females and young, and the right whales, in the southern right whales and the North Pacific right whales continued more coastally. And so literally the whalemen would move in, the whalemen would move in to a region, and sometimes in a place like Aotearoa, New Zealand, they would render them locally extinct in about a decade, and then move to another location. And so the thinking, or the rationalization of the whalemen was like, okay, we're just chasing the whales around. But in reality, of course, they were impacting local populations catastrophically, and then moving to another location. Shore whaling had been going on for a really long time, right? This idea of launching boats out to hunt whales had happened for over 1,500 years that we have documentation of, happening in Japan, happening in Indonesia, happening in Northern Europe, happening in the waters of the Inuit, and that's how it started in New England until they needed these larger and larger boats because they couldn't go, there weren't any whales to catch off of the coast, and so they went farther and farther away. But as they're moving into the Pacific and having more and more difficulty and going farther and farther north, and they're not finding sperm whales, they're not finding southern right whales, they're having to go all the way up into the Arctic to get bowheads, and then it's like, hey, there's a lot of whales off this California coastline. And Charles Scammon, and I brought, in addition to my books that I'm shamelessly selling, I also brought a collection of resources for this talk, and I'll put a bibliography at the end, and I think this talk is going to be online, right? So, but you're welcome to take a picture of any of these slides. I'll put a picture of the bibliography at the end. Feel free to take a picture of that. But some of these books you might be interested in. Charles Scammon's book is like, if you're interested in the history of whaling on the California coast, this is like the #1 book that you should get. And he was a super compelling guy. He was both a whaleman, he actually came from Maine. He was a whaleman. He hunted northern elephant seals. He hunted whales all along the coast. But he was also really interested in natural history and an artist. And so these are his illustrations. This is him writing about shore whaling. But he's probably more known outside of the California region for Scammon's Lagoon. Sort of this recognizing as they're looking for other whale markets, finding this birthing ground for gray whales in the Gulf of California, and bringing all these whalemen to go there to hunt these gray whales in this space. Later on, in 1874, he publishes sort of his career's worth of experience and knowledge but he's one of the mariners that opened up the sort of gray whale as another option for whalemen to catch. The gray whale, not as slow as southern right whale or North Pacific right whale, but it was more coastal, and particularly when you're finding them involved in giving birth or with young, they were really susceptible to hunting. So shore whaling starts to build here in California in the 1850s as a result of all these whalemen coming to this region, into the Pacific, and partly because they come here for the gold rush, they've come here for Hawaii, they've come here to buy land, they come to this region, but also because there wasn't as much success in some of this other whaling, because we're starting to kind of come down to what we refer to as Yankee whaling, the success of that for a whole bunch of reasons that we could go into if you're interested. We get started with California whaling, the first sort of these shore whaling stations starting in the 1850s. It starts with this guy and his wife to the right of the screen there. John Davenport, he's a New Englander. He's done some whaling. He comes to the Pacific. He's whaling out of Hawaii, and he recognizes, wow, there's a lot of whales here. I think I could make a home here and do some business. And so he sets up a whaling station here in Monterey, and Monterey tends to be mostly the center of it, and then it goes south, and then it goes north. But by the as we start to move into the mid-1800s, late 1800s, we're talking about 21 stations that are established up and down the California coast. They're not operational all at the same time. You know, some of them are up, some of them are down, some of them abandoned for 10 or 15 years, restarted, started in a different location. A major force in this shore whaling, there are some New Englanders that set it up, Americans coming around the coast or that are coming for the gold rush, but really the majority of the captains and the whalers that come are Portuguese or Azorean descent. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. Some of that is that the whalemen, as they were kind of moving farther and farther away to try to hunt whales, they would often stop for crew in the Azores and the Cape Verdes, and then as they moved into the Pacific, into South Pacific Islands, Hawaii, to get crew because it was becoming less and less interesting to some of those Yankee whalers that didn't want to go away from home for so long, or were less interested in the pay or the travels. And so Portuguese start to get involved in American whaling. They come around on whaling ships, and then they start to leave the offshore ships and establish stations here on the West Coast. And there's, for every person there's an individual reason. They came for one reason or another. This is just one example. Captain Jose Pedro Gomes, who came to Monterey. He was actually born in Portugal. Most of them are Azorean, but he was actually born in Portugal, probably in Lisbon. Came to California. He wanted to whale and established a whaling station in Monterey. Worked there for a while, stopped whaling for a while, and then picked up again in the region. And there's this fantastic newspaper article about him, which is in one of the books that are in the back, and it describes he was living in Monterey in the 1890s, and the fishermen were being bothered by humpback whales. Like the humpback whales were just too gregarious, they were in their way, and they wanted somebody to get rid of the whale. And so they were like, are there any, it was basically like, is there a whaler in the house? And he was like, well, I could help. And it's really interesting because we're talking I think it's 1890s, maybe it's 1880s, and he talks about, they're like, well, he found an old bomb lance. It was about 20 years old and dusted it off. It was this old technology, and he wasn't even sure if it was going to work, and he found some old guys, and they went out and they killed the whale. They didn't bring it in, they just killed it and sunk it to the bottom. This is Scammon also. This is one of our primary documents of, he did some great descriptions of the whaling stations and also these illustrations. He's got a whole bunch of birds in the foreground. This is kind of down at Carmel Bay. You can see that there's a sailing steamship in the background. Take my official pointer. This is kind of a neat little detail, right? We've got some sail right here where you've got a little steam stack right in here, which I think is kind of cool. They are hauling up whale right in there. So basically they would row out to the whale, they would catch it. The big difference also that enabled shore whaling is this, and again, not to get too gruesome, but how this would happen in the 16th, 17th, 18th, early 19th century is you rowed up to the whale and you threw a handheld harpoon, you attached yourself to the whale, and then with the weight of the boat and the crew, you tired out the whale, would try to stab it a couple more times, and eventually with the lance, try to kill it. Even in sort of Melville's day in the 1850s, they were developing these bomb lances and harpoon guns, which would enable, basically like explosives and the power of gunpowder to be able to harpoon farther away, to kill a whale faster, to not lose a whale. And so this technology was pretty much there from the beginning in California shore whaling. So in this image here, they've gone out to cut the whale, they've dragged it back. They've got this sort of block and tackle up there so they can raise it up here, and you can see that smoke coming out of the try-works. So they're basically boiling out the oil and putting it in pots, and then either putting it on a ship or, as we move into the 1870s, across the Isthmus of Panama or by railroad, bringing it to distant markets. These are another couple of illustrations which some of you might not have seen. I feel like a lot of the historians know the scamming illustration. These illustrations I think are a little less known. Also not 1970. These would be 1870. This is the Pigeon Point Whaling Co. And here we're kind of talking more on those of you that know Pigeon Point, this is kind of more on the north side of Pigeon Point. So they kind of had whaling stations on both sides at different times. And so this is a really interesting illustration here. And one thing that I really like about it is, if any of you are a small boat enthusiast, this is not a New England rig right here. This is a Lantine Portuguese style sailboat. And so I think that's pretty cool. And you see these vessels here going out on their way. And so it's basically the same it's the same point right there. And they've set up the try-works up on the on the point there, and again they brought the whale ashore. They tried to bring it in on a high tide, beach the whale, and then cut off the blubber. This is one of the, many of you might have seen this photograph before. This is one of the sort of remaining photographs of the gear. Now we're actually on the south side of Pigeon Point, kind of what we sort of, where I think the signage is now that kind of talks about Whalers Cove off of Pigeon Point. And in 1872, a visitor arriving at this station in the fall, several months before the gray whale season, reported they had cut up 12 whales already and killed and lost 10 more. So there was a big problem with any kind of whaling, and particularly for conservation biologists that are trying to say, like, okay, how many whales did these whalemen kill? Well, it's hard to know, right? Because a lot of times they would injure a whale and not retrieve it, and so that whale might survive or it might die. And so, killed and lost 10 more. All were humpbacks. A similar station at Carmel Cove was described in sketch in 1875. That one we just saw. This is in a book, Monterey Bay Area Natural History and Cultural Imprints. That's the correct date, 1977. That's also a real gem of a book if you haven't seen it. It's a really great environmental history of the area that is out of print. This was that sort of opening slide is from this picture here. And it's a Harper's Weekly cover, and many a historian has been like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, it's on the cover of Harper's Weekly, I'm going to get this whole article about it, but there's no article about it, there's just this little paragraph here. But it is an interesting little paragraph where it talks about, that much of the founding of the whaling stations here, Portuguese, and when we talk about Sandwich Islanders, talking about people from Hawaii. I'm not sure where that station is. Maybe some of you might know. I've not seen anyone who's been like, okay, that is that location, but maybe that is out there. This is that same captain that I mentioned before, Jose Pedro Gomes, and he's here, he's posing with a greener harpoon gun in Monterey Bay. And so he's doing, basically they're doing like a photo essay for the Cosmopolitan magazine in 1900. But you can kind of see the whalemen, the size of the boats, the technology they're working with. These are the other, David Bartow, and I might be pronouncing that incorrectly, basically did a thesis on Portuguese whaling in the California coast. His book is back there. He assembled amazing statistics and information about the people that were here. And so he kind of really points out here that the Pigeon Point and Pillar Point whale stations were really kind of moving around to different locations. They would be dormant for a little while. Different people would be involved. And they were sort of set up these companies. And sometimes the captain would move. You know, he'd come. They were like, gosh, we need somebody with a little more expertise. They'd get someone from Southern California to come up, someone from Humboldt County to come down, and they would interchange. And so some of the whalemen would move, you know, to various stations. They would move with family, of course. They would go out. They would come back into it to talk about some of the stations that are here. This is is Mark here tonight? So he's written a lot for the Half Moon Bay Historical Society, and so he made this really cool. He wrote an article about whaling in Pillow Point in your newsletter, and made this map, and you can kind of see that Whaleman Harbor up there labeled on, I think that was, it's probably, maybe it's still labeled there on Google Maps. He pointed out that he thought that was the location because it's much more shallow, and that would be a place where you'd be able to bring in whales up into that area. There'd just be too much wave action right in this space if you wanted to process a whale. So I mentioned Scammon already. I want to just mention him again because he's this really interesting bridge of, and we have other people in Western history that are both hunters and naturalists, right? You know, Scammon brought that sort of hunter's knowledge to what he did and what he wrote. And in that book, he has this huge illustration of a whale eye, really close up, this sort of sensitive, beautiful image of a whale eye. And it's just such a really compelling thing of when we think about those people standing in 1910 on the coast, and we think about our relationship with animals, right? Like I can have a stuffed pig, but then I might eat, bacon and eggs. And, like how do I like square these sort of relationships with animals, and how do whales fit into that? And so Scammon is a really interesting figure in that, and his book is a really interesting bridge as we move into the 20th century. When we talk about how are the whales doing, and now you're going to be like, well, which species are you talking about? Because industrial whaling opens up in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and that's new technologies that enable whalemen to be able to hunt all oceans and all species. Steel hulls, diesel engine, enormous hydraulic power blocks where you can actually pull a whale, as you can see in that upper left, actually pull a whale up onto the ship, process it while you're looking for other whales. Air injection guns, and again, I'm sorry, this is just like so brutal, but like after you killed the whale, a lot of the baleen whales would sink after you hunted them. And right whales also would sink. It's one of those things where they were like, oh, it's the right whale to hunt because it never sunk, but they did sink, not as much, but a blue whale, a sei whale, a Brutus whale often would sink when it was killed. And so they would literally inject the whales with air so that they could keep them afloat and tie up 5 or 6 of them waiting to be processed at a time. They're moving into the far northern Arctic, far southern ocean. And so they're hunting all whales, all species, all places, all around. And so the impact on those sort of larger whales is really happening in this industrial era. It's not happening from those whalemen under sail in the 19th century. The 19th century whalemen are decimating sperm whale cultures and populations. They're rendering nearly extinct the North Atlantic right whale, southern right whale, which is coming back, North Pacific right whale, big impact on bowheads, big impact on gray whales, but the rest of the whales are really being impacted in this industrial era. We have industrial whaling stations here in Monterey Bay. This is Moss Landing. This is a Moss Landing station right here. They were primarily catching humpbacks, but they would catch sperm whales sometimes. And there's in the photo we have 20, 30 photographs from this whaling station. We have some interesting reports from the whaling station, and so a pretty good record about the whales that they were hunting and going out there. And interestingly, a lot of the expertise was coming from Norway. We had Norwegian whalemen coming over with a lot of the technology that they developed with explosive harpoons up on the deck, and bringing that technology to the area. We had whaling all the way into 1971 in San Pablo Whaling Station in San Francisco Bay. I know some people that know that image pretty well in the audience. Eventually shut down because of the impending Marine Mammal Protection Act and just inability to make money and inability to sort of fend off public opinion. Industrial whaling, they're using more of the whale now. So they're less interested in the blubber for lubrication, for light, and more using it for soaps, margarine, they're using the meat, they're using the bone, pet food, fertilizer, a whole range of different different products. And post-World War II, it was used as a lot of redevelopment for Chile and Japan to build their whaling fleets to bring income back to their economies. So now we move into that realm of like, where does that come from? Like, where have we made a turn? If we've made a turn, if we are different from those people standing on the beach in 1910 looking at that whale, where do some of those things come from? And so people that sort of trace some of these cultural evolutions point to some of these sort of landmarks. One of them is surprisingly sound. Not so much like a cute little whale, but actually the hearing of whales, the sound of whales. And that, ironically, is coming from that World War II technology, listening for submarines, developing those underwater acoustics, and some of those scientists, a couple of different groups, were listening to whale echolocation clicks, songs, communication, and starting to learn, identify them with species, and then bringing them back. It started with belugas, but then humpbacks, blue whales, sperm whales, and early 19th century mariners heard some of those sounds, particularly of sperm whales, but not sort of connecting with echolocation, or, as would happen as we moved into the 1970s, connecting that with a real sentience, with love, with compassion, with communication. And so when you start to develop the sound of whales, that was one of the major turning points, at least in American impact. In 1979, Ralph Payne's whaling, and maybe some people in the audience remember getting their National Geographic with a little record in the middle that had whale sounds on it. Maybe you heard that Joni Mitchell song that had the whale song interlaid into her music. He had released a full album in 1970, all whale songs. And so this is linked, I can pass. You can find it on YouTube, super easy to find. And just to listen to that sound, and so that sound had a big impact on people. And then, of course, there's underwater photography and scuba, which is enabling, when we're kind of working with college students, it's always be like, all right, think about a shark. And immediately, we all have a pretty clear idea of what a shark looks like, what it's doing underwater, and how it moves. How in the world, it's just we've been watching TV, we've been watching documentaries, we've been seeing underwater color photography for our whole lives. And so we feel like we have a really good understanding of what those things look like. That's like the tiniest blip, of course, in human history, our ability to be able to have this footage, this photography underwater. Cousteau is having a major impact. He's writing a book about the whale in 1972. But if you compare it to someone like Rachel Carson, her whole Sea trilogy, she barely writes about whales at all in the 1940s. It's not really very much on her radar. But it starts to move into the 1970s. 1970s, we have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act. Whales start to be connected to the nuclear movement, the no nukes movement, and we start to move into our marine sanctuaries and establish them. And I think there's all sorts of things going on in terms of our changing relationship with whales and the public. The Flipper movie is something that people talk a lot about, and then eventually the TV show, and just that sort of Lassie in the ocean, and sort of the friendly dolphin, and we've got that orca, we've got the Marine World Theater starting in the late 60s in San Mateo County. People going to be entertained by whales, although that goes back, into late 1800s, where people have been bringing whales back into big tanks, so we can look at that. Okay, so that kind of brings us a little bit to that modern era. See, these are some of those sources. The majority of them are in the back, and I'd be delighted for you to flip through them and look at them. They're all pretty easy to find online. Is Joanne Simone's here? She's like one of our local historians. She's written 5 or 6 books about the coast side and the various museums. So if you haven't checked out her work, she's got a lot of really fantastic books in the area. I was serious about the whale watch. I talked to I'm just starting to work there and it's super fun. And so they said, yeah, you need to mention the talk and you get $10. There's a lot of people don't know you don't have to drive down to Monterey to go on a whale watch. Half Moon Bay probably has whale watches too, right? Anyway, but it's a great whale watch. They're great people. I'm really enjoying working there. These are some of the books that I've written. I think all of them are in the back. I draw an illustration in each book. I brought my colored pencils, and so if there's anything that you, a particular animal or favorite or something like that, this is the book that's probably most relevant to the talk, the Ahab's Rolling Sea, and there I sort of took Moby Dick and sort of used that as a social benchmark and said, okay, what did Melville know? What did he infuse into his fiction? And what did we know in the 1850s, and how has that changed in terms of our history of science?
Okay, well, let's thank Richard one more time.
Thank you all for coming.
Please feel free to stick around and have a chat with Richard afterwards. And we want to thank everyone for coming. We had such a nice crowd tonight.